being confused for 2 members of Congress.
You do have a congressional
I
barrier.
ran for Congress.
But that's usually enough, just to look the part. But apparently not. Yeah, you look the part more than Keller does. That's for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I tried winning my books, but that didn't happen.
It was a race to the bottom in that case. Yeah.
Now we're going through my phone. That's a congressman. He's a senator. So it's like, no, not yet.
This big guy. Go on, Bill.
Good afternoon. The subcommittee will come to order. This afternoon, the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Subcommittee will take a critical look at the impact of fluorinated chemicals known as PFAS on our service members. This is an issue that directly affects our military readiness. Ensuring the health and well-being of our men and women in uniform and their families is vital to developing a strong fighting force that can face the world's threats. Unfortunately, just like we highlighted last week in our hearing on the failures of privatized housing, our service members are facing threats of a more widespread and insidious nature with this issue. In this case, it's the threat from dangerous, long-lasting chemicals that are far, far too present on and around our military bases. For decades, PFAS chemicals were used in a variety of industrial and consumer applications, and notably on military bases in firefighting foams. But knowing what we know now, it is long past time to move away from these products and onto newer, safer formulations that are just as effective. Shifting to the use of new and improved products is just one part of the challenge facing our military. Another part is cleaning up the legacy contamination that already exists. And on top of that, being honest with service members and their families about the scope of the problem and explaining the work being done to address it is critical. I'm proud that the Appropriations bill that we passed last year provided an additional $60 million for PFAS identification, mitigation, and cleanup at closed military locations under our BRAC account, which is the area of our jurisdiction related to this issue. This subcommittee is committed to doing our part to invest in these critical cleanup efforts. I was also pleased to vote for a House-passed bill, the PFAS Action Act of 2019, that would provide a comprehensive approach to regulating PFAS chemicals, cleaning up contamination, and protecting public health. It is deeply disappointing and irresponsible that the Senate hasn't acted on this legislation, but I can assure you that we are not giving up on this issue or the service members who are affected by it. As I said earlier, this is an issue that affects our military readiness, and it demands actions. Mr. Holmes, I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you and your wife earlier this year in my office. I sit on the Oversight Committee in addition to the Appropriations Committee, where we had an extensive hearing with the companies that have been responsible for the for these chemicals, their production, and the damage that they've done to thousands of people. So we look forward to hearing your testimony today. We will have in our first panel Mr. Jim Holmes, a former Army and Air Force helicopter pilot who was stationed for years at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. Patrick Air Force Base, I want to mention, has had PFAS levels detected at 4,338,000 parts per trillion. By way of comparison, my colleagues, the risk level found by CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is 11 parts per trillion for PFOA, and for PFOS it is 7 parts per trillion. 7. That's when you start seeing real health risks, when it's higher than that. Patrick Air Force Base is emblematic of the massive problem we are facing on our military bases. Hearing from Mr. Holmes on his and his family's experience, I can assure you will be eye-opening. But Patrick Air Force Base is certainly not alone. A GAO report found that as of August 2017, DoD has identified over 400 active or closed military installations with known or suspected releases of PFOS or PFOA. And other estimates have found that if you expand beyond just military sites, you're looking at over 1,000 sites throughout the country with PFAS contamination. We are also joined by Mr. Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. The Environmental Working Group has done a tremendous amount of work in establishing the hazards of PFAS chemicals and has been leading the charge to fully clean up this contamination. On our second panel, we will hear from Ms. Maureen Sullivan, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment at the Department of Defense. She'll give us a chance to learn more about remediation efforts and other programs underway at DoD to address this pervasive challenge. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. We look forward to hearing your testimony. Before we recess, because the House has called votes, and we'll return following votes for your opening statements as witnesses, but I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Judge Carter, for his opening statement.
I thank the gentlelady for recognizing me. Welcome to both of you. I have heard the story. I'm looking forward to hearing it from you. I've read all about what this is about, and this is sad and serious. This subcommittee plays just a small part in the larger discussion and debate about environmental management regulation and remediation of our military installations. our role is limited to funding the cleanup of former military bases. With that in mind, I'm looking forward to hearing about PFAS chemicals and the Defense Department's plans and activities. I'm especially interested in firefighting foams. Yesterday, the subcommittee held a hearing for members to highlight their specific concerns and priorities. Richard Hudson, one of our colleagues from North Carolina, pleaded with us to invest in Fort Bragg's infrastructure, especially facilities used by our conventional force. That's 82nd. He told us that there is insufficient emergency support infrastructure around the airfield to deal with fires or other mishaps during deployment activities. He asked us to imagine the chaos that would consume the airfield as paratroopers trapped in a plane burned alive because proper firefighting resources could not get to them. I agree with him. That's not much would be worse to imagine than that, except perhaps the 1967 fire on the USS Forrestal that killed 134 of our sailors. To me, today's hearing is not about whether we prioritize people over environment or vice versa. It's about how we can take care of both. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines need effective firefighting methods to preserve life and property. We also need clean air and clean water. I know this subcommittee will do its best to provide both through the programs in our jurisdiction. I thank the chairwoman for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Before we recess, I just want to make the witnesses aware. I have to ask my questions in the Oversight Committee upon returning, and so Mr. Bishop will chair the subcommittee during your opening statement, and I'll return following my asking of those questions. And the subcommittee stands in recess until immediately following votes. Okay. The subcommittee will reconvene. We now welcome our first panel. As I mentioned, our witnesses are Mr. Jim Holmes and Mr. Scott Faber. Mr. Holmes, as I said earlier, listening to your story was really gut-wrenching, and I'm glad that the members of our subcommittee are going to have an opportunity to hear from you about what you and your family experienced. Your full written testimony will be entered into the record without objection, and you're recognized to summarize your remarks for 5 minutes.
First of all, thanks to all of you for allowing me and my wife to share our story. My name is Jim Holmes. I recently retired from the United States Army Reserve. During my 25-plus years, I served both on active duty and in the reserve component, performing multiple combat deployments that ranged from Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm to Operation Iraqi Freedom. From the day I enlisted on December 8th of 1988, I knew that there were certain risks associated with my service in the armed forces. I knew that I was signing a contract that required me to risk my own physical health, mental health, personal safety, and up to my life in defense of the nation. I fully understood and willingly accepted these risks. What I did not sign up for is risking of my daughter's health, well-being, and ultimately her life as a result of my service. On January 10th, 2018, I was flying Hurricane Maria recovery missions when I received a phone call from my family doctor that would forever change the lives of myself, my wife, and my daughter. My wife took Kayla to the eye doctor because she was having blurred vision. We thought she just needed a new set of glasses. What we found out is that Kayla had an extremely rare and aggressive form of brain cancer called DIPG. DIPG is a form of brain cancer that forms inside the brainstem and affects 150 to 300 children annually in the United States. It's difficult to treat and 100% fatal. Kayla was a beautiful, intelligent, loving daughter who loved her Army family with all her heart. She made a positive impact on everyone she encountered, excelled in school, and never disappointed me once in her 17 years of life. Kayla bravely fought the cancer for 15 months. During this time, she displayed a mental and physical toughness that few people in this world know. Unfortunately, on March 29th, 2019, 3 days after her 17th birthday, Kayla passed away with my wife, our family dog, and myself at her side. What hurt almost as bad as Kayla's passing was finding out a few months after her death that her cancer was possibly caused by water contamination at Patrick Air Force Base. We had lived at South Housing at Patrick from 2004 to 2005 and at Central Housing from 2008 to 2013. Kayla also attended Sea Park Elementary School for 5 years and went to the Patrick Air Force Base after-school program and attended Satellite High School, all at Satellite Beach. Not once in the 16 years we've lived in the Patrick Air Force Base community were we ever made aware that the groundwater was severely contaminated with a hazardous substance called PFAS. The Air Force and 45th Space Wing never publicly disclosed to those of us living on and around Patrick that their own water samples had shown that they were 57,000 times above the EPA's safe drinking water level of 70 parts per trillion. The failure to disclose such critical information showed a complete lack of care for the health and safety of the service members, dependents, and civilians that live on and around Patrick Air Force Base. The PFAS contamination at Patrick has been attributed to the reckless deployment of AFFF firefighting foam during training exercises over the past 50 years. The Department of Defense created AFFF in the late 60s, knew by the 70s that it was toxic to fish, and by the 80s it was shown to be toxic to animals. By the 2000s, PFAS was found to be building up in our blood supply. During this time, the residents of Satellite Beach, Florida have experienced a much higher rate of brain and breast cancers than the general population. Even as residents were raising alarms over the high rate of cancer in the local area, the Air Force stood quiet. Fortunately, Congress stepped in recently and banned the use of AFFF during training exercises. This is a common sense action that should have been taken by the DoD decades ago. The fact that Congress had to make the DoD discontinuing AFFF in training exercises once again shows the DoD's complete lack of concern for the health of the general public. The next step in this PFAS journey is to make the water safe for the service members, dependents, and civilian population that resides around Patrick Air Force Base. The Air Force will lead you to believe that all is well because they use the City of Melbourne water. What they don't tell you is that the infrastructure at Patrick Air Force Base is extremely old. Broken water mains happen regularly, and every time there's a drop in water pressure, our pipes are being flooded with this toxic mess. The people of Satellite Beach need Congress to immediately ban all use of AFFF firefighting foams that contain PFAS and PFBS and force the United States Air Force to take responsibility for polluting our water with toxic chemicals over the years. The time since Kayla has passed away has been quite difficult. I lost my only child due to being poisoned by the same military that I faithfully served and fought for. When I learned of the connection of PFAS and Kayla's cancer, I got rid of all my awards, certificates, and uniforms. The only thing I have with a military connection is my retired ID card. I'll have to live the rest of my life knowing that my decision to serve in the military and reside on a United States Air Force base resulted in the death of my daughter. Let that sink in for a minute. For me to serve my nation, I had to give the U.S. government my health, physically, mentally, and then at the end of it, they took my daughter. I pray that no other service member will ever have to knowingly sacrifice the life of their child by serving their country. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and allow my family's tragedy to be heard. When Kayla was born on March 26, 2002, the war on terror had just begun. My biggest worry was that I would be injured or killed in combat and that Kayla would grow up without a father. I spent every free moment I had building a lifelong connection with my daughter, making sure that she knew for certain that her father loved her. I trained hard, bought life insurance, did my best to ensure she'd be taken care of if something happened to me. I never imagined she would be the one paying the ultimate price for my service.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. We are deeply sorry for your loss. I have a 16-and-a-half-year-old daughter, so I certainly can't begin to know what you've experienced, but we are here in this hearing because of you and your story, and you're honoring the memory of your daughter and ensuring that, at the very least, as we discussed when we were in my office, that her loss would not be in vain, and that others might not have to in the future go through what you and your wife have gone through. So may her memory be for a blessing. Mr. Faber, your full written testimony will be entered into the record without objection, and you're also recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing attention to this important issue and for making the remediation of PFAS a priority in the FY 2020 Appropriations Bill. My name is Scott Faber. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. We're a national environmental health organization that has sought for 2 decades to address the health impacts of PFAS pollution. As you know, PFAS contaminate the blood of every American, of all of us, and have been linked to very serious health problems, including cancer, harm to the reproductive system, and harm to the immune system. Because PFAS never break down and because they build up in our blood and organs, they're often referred to as forever chemicals. As you've heard, the DoD use of firefighting foam made with PFAS, or what's also known as aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, has disproportionately exposed our military service members and their families to PFAS pollution. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, EWG has so far been able to confirm the presence of PFAS in the tap water or groundwater at 328 military installations. Until recently, PFAS contaminated the drinking water of dozens of military bases, and many communities near these installations continue to struggle with contaminated drinking water. As you've also heard, EPA has set an advisory level of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, 2 members of this class of chemicals. And through our FOIAs, we discovered that many of the highest detections in the nation have been found on or near DoD installations. In particular, we found PFAS detections at 14 installations that were more than 1 million parts per trillion, far above the 70 parts per trillion level recommended by the EPA and far above the safe levels identified by the chairwoman by the Centers for Disease Control. The highest PFAS detection at Patrick Air Force Base, where Mr. Holmes served, was 4.3 million parts per trillion. Again, the advisory level from EPA is 70 parts per trillion. The highest detection at Langley Air Force Base, where retired military firefighter Kevin Ferrara served, was 2.2 million parts per trillion. And military firefighters like Mr. Ferrara are especially vulnerable because they not only drank water contaminated with PFAS for decades, they also routinely handled AFFF, these PFAS foams, without protective equipment. DoD officials have understood the risks of AFFF for many years. As Mr. Holmes said, the Navy and Air Force first understood that PFAS was toxic to fish in the 70s and toxic to animals in the 1980s. But DoD waited a decade to warn service members like Mr. Holmes and Mr. Ferrara, and most remain unaware of the risks posed by PFAS pollution. And despite these risks, DoD has been slow to switch away from AFFF and has been slow to clean up legacy pollution. Thanks to your leadership, the NDAA for FY 2020 included important bipartisan reforms, including a ban on the use of AFFF in training exercises and a requirement that DoD end the use of fluorinated foams like AFFF by 2024, but this has fallen far short of what's needed to address the serious health risks posed by PFAS. In particular, we must do much more to ensure that people living on bases and near bases have clean water. We must do much more to remediate legacy contamination, building on the progress that you made in the FY 2020 Appropriations Bill. And we must do a much better job of notifying current and former service members and their families about the risks that they have faced for decades by consuming water contaminated with PFAS or handling AFFF. So let me stop there and thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Faber. Thank you both. Excuse me. We'll proceed with our questions as we normally do. Members will be recognized from when we gavelled in order of seniority. If the members could please keep their questions as well as leaving time for the witnesses to answer within your 5-minute turn. I'll begin, Mr. Holmes, with you. Again, thank you for your service and thank you for your advocacy, because you certainly don't have to be in front of our committee today. And it's really incredibly admirable that you're taking the time to make people more aware of this issue, shine a spotlight on it, and help right some of the wrongs. I've been concerned since we spoke, and I want to just underscore to the members that while I had an opportunity to speak with Mr. Holmes and his wife about their specific situation, as you've heard in the testimony, this is a massive problem across military bases all across this country and the world, and so this is one example, but there are many others. But when we spoke, I was dismayed to see the communications that you showed me from the leadership, from the 45th Space Wing commander, that seemed to dismiss the severity of the problem. I mean, to see a member of base leadership be so dismissive of even assessments done by the Air Force itself is very troubling. I don't have that, but if we can pull that communication from the wing commander that was sent to the troops, the service members on Patrick Air Force Base, I'd like to enter that into the record without objection. If you can describe that communication and talk with us about whether that was typical of the communication from the base or Department of Defense officials on the situation with PFAS at Patrick Air Force Base?
Basically, what we've been told, ma'am, is there's no problem here. They don't have a problem, they don't see the need of a problem, and they're not going to deal with it. I actually have the city manager from Satellite Beach here with me and the vice mayor, which they've been told pretty much the same thing by the leadership at Patrick Air Force Base. They admit that they contaminated the soil. They admit that the source of the PFAS is from the foam coming from them. They say that they have no regulatory requirement to clean it up, and basically we're on our own. The city of Satellite Beach, where I live at, we've got about 12,000 residents. Within the past year, we've had 15 residents come down with rare forms of brain cancer and rare cases of breast cancer. And then what hit me like a ton of bricks is I was having lunch with a friend of mine I'd flown with him in the Army and in the Air Force. Matt's like a uncle to my daughter. And he told me, he said, we were flying a mission Thursday night, and he said, I about broke out crying. And I said, why? He found out that another retired member of the squadron daughter just came down with brain cancer last week. That makes 16 in a community of 12,000 people. But yet the Air Force and the DOD still refuse to accept responsibility and to clean this mess up.
I just want to ask you a follow-up question, and I am limited in time, but do members of the community that lived in and around Patrick Air Force Base believe that DOD's response to the crisis of PFAS contamination was adequate? What more did you feel they could be doing? I do have the communication, and without objection would like it to be entered into the record. And as you described, it does specifically dismiss the explicit suggestion from the Air Force's own study about the contamination of the drinking water and the groundwater.
It's been totally inadequate, ma'am. The Air Force leadership and the DOD has completely failed every service member, dependent, and civilian person living on and around Patrick Air Force Base.
Mr. Faber, I want to ask you the same question, if you think DOD's response was adequate. And, I mean, is there anything that you can attribute the I don't even understand how a wing commander could directly contradict a study coming from the Air Force itself.
It's hard for me to explain why leaders at particular installations would say that DOD does not have a responsibility or is unable to clean up legacy PFAS pollution. But we've seen, and you've seen some of it in my testimony, examples of where DOD has said, we are not responsible because Congress nor EPA have designated PFAS as hazardous substances under the Superfund law, under CERCLA. And so, unfortunately, at different places around the country, DOD is telling service members and their families that until Congress acts, this isn't their problem to solve. That's not true. DOD has, as you know, has funds through the Defense Environmental Restoration Program, through the BRAC funding you provided last year, resources to help remedy legacy pollution, but that's not the consistent story they're getting from local commanders.
Thank you. My time's expired. Judge Carter?
Thank you. And Mr. Holmes, I lost a child at 9 months, but having one that was practically grown and raised has to be a much bigger loss. But you never forget it. So don't let it destroy your family. And we're going to try to help. I've got a voice problem, a lot of other problems probably. But Mr. Faber, you know this subcommittee plays a small part in this PFAS cleanup. Our focus is on bases that have been closed. Do you have specific recommendations for us? Are there specific locations, former bases, that we should focus on?
Thank you for the question. I would urge you to build on the progress that you made in the FY 2020 appropriations bill, where you did provide funds specifically for PFAS remediation. There are about 47 of the 47, we think, of the 328 installations where we've now confirmed PFAS detections are BRAC facilities. But it's impossible. Some of them have very, very high detections. The single highest detection in the nation is a BRAC facility. So clearly, more resources are going to be needed in order to clean up this legacy pollution. You can help all of us by asking DOD to tell us more about their plans and what resources they will need to clean up this legacy pollution. You can also help all of us by ensuring that the companies that help create this problem pay their fair share of the cost. It shouldn't simply be the taxpayer who has to bear the cost of cleanup, which will be significant.
I'm sure you look into other pollutions, and we've dealt with this before. We've got places in California that we had a member of this Congress yelled about the whole time he was here, and as far as I know, we've never cleaned it up. But what other elements, contaminants, are in these places that we should be seriously concerned about? Yeah. Lead, asbestos,
absolutely. There are legacy contaminants in addition to PFAS, asbestos, lead, TCE. I'm sure this committee is familiar with many of them. PFAS are unique because they are forever chemicals because of this unique chemistry, this carbon-fluorine bond. They last forever. They have a half-life in the body of anywhere from 2 to 8 years. And they have been strongly linked to very, very serious health problems, including harms to the immune system that make vaccines less effective, harms to the reproductive system that result in low birth weights. These are unique chemicals that need our immediate attention.
Well, we're going to do what we can with what we've got. And this is, I'm sure there's a lot of people that you just told us about going through the same kind of crisis that you went through. I went through brain cancer with my Air Force pilot brother-in-law. So I know what kind of trial and tribulation that is. We'll do what we can with what we got. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Mr. Case?
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I just want you to know that I fully embrace the comments of my chair and ranking member. As you can tell, this has no partisanship whatever in it. This committee is committed on a nonpartisan basis to listening to you, and you asked us to hear, and I did hear. So that's one member of Congress. I listened, and so did everybody else here and everybody else that's watching. This is very difficult for us. We can't change the past. We can't bring your daughter back. But we can try to figure out what we can do now, because we can try to change the future. And so in that spirit, I want to constructively ask you both what exactly should be done at this point. And I'm focusing here more, I understand the big pictures of banning these uses, of cleaning up. I think we would all agree on those. I think I'm a little bit more interested for now on preventing further harm in the situation that we have right now. There are service members out there and their families and the people that are on and around our bases that are still in harm's way, I would assume. And what do you think that we should try to do for them right now? I'm thinking about things like disclosure. I'm thinking about a whole range of issues, some of which were in the House-passed bill, which is unfortunately not passed Congress yet. You had a couple of recommendations, Mr. Holmes, in your testimony. Can you give me more specific recommendations from your communications with your colleagues, with your family, if I can put it that way, your broader family?
Yes, sir. Satellite Beach is a different situation. They run on Patrick Air Force Base and Satellite have City of Melbourne water, but the infrastructure is very old. Water mains break, pipes get flooded. Satellite Beach has tested the pipes at the high school and in the city, and they are picking up PFAS in the pipes. My recommendation is a short-term solution, there's an EPA-approved point-of-entry filter you can attach to your house that will filter all of this out, which will make the water safe for everyone. And so my proposal is It will cost about $23 million to equip every house in Satellite Beach, Cocoa Beach, and the military housing with these filters. That's 21% the cost of an F-135 fighter. Yeah, we spent $73 million buying Afghani school kids' books last year. Yeah, can we not spend a couple of million to give safe drinking water to our people? And to me, that's the immediate need that we have, is to ensure people are getting clean water today, not 10 years from now.
How about from a disclosure perspective?
They need to disclose to anyone renting on base that that water is contaminated. They need to disclose to the civilian population. They need to do health monitoring. They need to provide money to the city so that the city, the Air Force has already told us that they're not monitoring the water and mapping the plume. So the city of Satellite Beach is having to absorb that cost on their own. That should be funded by the DOD.
Can I just add that many of you are familiar with the map that EWG's created that shows detections, and we have a whole team of people who submit Freedom of Information Act requests, read those documents. We have a whole team of toxicologists who tell us what those documents mean. It shouldn't be that hard for a service member or dependent who has served, is serving, to know, is there PFAS in my drinking water now? Has there been PFAS in my drinking water while I was on base for that period of time over the last 50 years? If I'm a retired firefighter, is there PFAS building up in my blood? Retired firefighters are not now eligible for the same blood tests that active duty firefighters are. So we should do a much better job of letting service members and dependents and defense communities know what's in, not just what's in the water now, but what have people been drinking for decades, so they can.
Is it simple
prepare for
enough?
those risks.
Is it simple enough to test for the presence of PFAS in water, where you could get a regular statement from the water distributor, whoever that is, as to presence and/or levels?
And I think Ms. Sullivan's going to testify to DOD's plans to test now going forward for water that's being now consumed on base. What's missing is all of the people who live in defense communities. These plumes don't stop at the fence line.
I understand that, yeah.
Yeah, and many people are, especially in places like China Lake or rural places, are on wells and are really on their own.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Faber, Naval Air Station Jacksonville is located in my district, and they're currently testing well drinking water on and around the military installation, and they're getting permission from private citizens, right? Can you tell me how that whole process works, and are people, just tell me how that testing is going around NAS Jacks.
Yeah, so in recent years, DOD has done testing, and of course, Ms. Sullivan will testify to this as well. They did, one of the highest detections in the nation was found at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. I believe it was almost 1.4 million parts per trillion. There has been periodic testing of the drinking water that might be provided by utilities to people living on base or near bases, but that is not currently required under the Safe Drinking Water Act, nor is it required under any other law. So I was pleased to see that DOD is now going to do routine testing on base. There will be no similar requirement for people who might be in defense communities.
Right. And that has me want to go back to the recommendations that you had. I agree that we should accelerate the banning of this product. 2024 is ridiculous.
I agree.
And so I was glad to see you put that in here. Also, I have a question on the phase out of other sources of PFAS, because this was interesting to me because I didn't know this. Can you talk about some of those other sources that, I thought this was all just the foam.
Yeah.
Apparently, this is in a lot of other things as well. Is that correct?
Thanks for that question. So the NDAA for FY 2020 actually bans the use of PFAS in military food packaging. If you aren't stationed at a place like Patrick or Jacksonville, it's probably the case that your food is a bigger source of PFAS than your drinking water. And one of the primary ways that PFAS gets into food is it migrates out of the food packaging. But other common, arguably non-essential uses of PFAS are in our personal care products. Half the same chemical that we use to make pans nonstick are used in hundreds of cosmetic products. It's used in sunscreens. They're used in textiles. They're used to make carpets stain resistant. They're used in so there are many other uses on base that could easily be replaced, and that could reduce the amount of PFAS that's ultimately building up in our blood.
So would CERCLA stop all of that?
Unfortunately not, yeah. So just designating PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA, all that does is kickstart the cleanup process for legacy pollution and require some reporting, and importantly, require that the companies that made billions selling these chemicals help share some of the costs of cleanup. But you can, or through other statutes, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or through the next NDAA, ban some of these uses or phase out some of these other, I think, obviously non-essential uses like making your carpet stain resistant or making your clothing waterproof. Thank you for the question.
Okay, and the so HR 535 would actually put it on the list. HR 2195 would create a registry of these items so that people would know, like, I had no idea. And then secondly, is there a program within DOD right now to test these individuals that like Mr. Holmes, who have been exposed? Are they testing your blood at all?
No, sir.
They're not. As a result of the last NDAA, active duty military firefighters will have their blood tested as part of their routine physical. Retired service members are not being routinely tested for PFAS in their blood serum.
They're also not testing dependents.
Okay. You know, Madam Chair, this looks like another Agent Orange barreling down on us. And Mr. Holmes, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thanks, sir.
God bless you.
Thank you,
I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. By the way, I think it's important to note that 3M, which is a manufacturer of these chemicals, completely denies that there is any danger whatsoever to human beings who ingest these chemicals. Yeah, on the record in an oversight committee hearing. They also, the companies that manufacture these chemicals also have expressly indicated that they don't believe they owe any compensation or need to contribute to the costs of cleanup of any of these. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about that in our next panel.
Well, Madam Chair, if I could just add, I
Yes.
think 16 cases out of 12,000 is certainly worth studying.
Yeah, that's called a cluster,
Yeah.
and that means that it should be looked into. Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I appreciate your thoughtful questions. Ms. Pingree?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Holmes, thank you so much for being willing to share your story with us, and I had an opportunity to chat with you a little bit, and I just am really grateful that you're willing to be here, that you're able to be so thoughtful about what we should be doing and sharing so much with us, so thank you, and I'm so sorry for your loss. My colleagues have asked some really good questions. Many of them were on my list, so thank you, colleagues, for not leaving me any. But here's a couple. So, Mr. Holmes, I understand that there is no routine testing. I'm curious, should you choose to get tested, or if you've already been tested, how expensive is this as a civilian to just go out and do it?
I've been told that the test is $750 per test.
And it's not routinely done at a
No, ma'am.
physical assurance companies don't demand it or anything else?
No, ma'am.
And during this whole period of time, did you get anything from, about your drinking water, anything, any kind of notice?
Only notices we got, ma'am, is when the pipes would break, we'd get a boiled water notice. They kill any microbes. But one of the problems with PFAS, as I found out, is that you can't boil PFAS out of water. And so the base would put out a notice saying, boil the water to drink it, but it was still contaminated.
Yeah, that's not an adequate response. And as far as you know, in other bases, no other active duty military person has ever been informed about all these bases that we know about.
And the only thing I've learned about PFAS has been from Scott Faber and the advocacy work that we've done after Kayla passed away. I had no idea.
So you'd never heard of it until you lost your...
No, ma'am.
Yeah, that's terrible. Mr. Faber, thank you for being here. Thank you for the great work that you at EWG and everyone else has been doing to help bring this into light. One thing I've been interested in, besides all of the things my colleagues already asked about, is that I know there have been at least one case where it's had an effect on livestock and agriculture. We have a different PFAS contamination issue in our own state, but I've learned a lot about what can happen. Can you tell me, is that very common? Do we know many instances of that, and yet another way for people to get, injured?
Yeah, so as we were, Mr. Rutherford and I were talking about a moment ago, food is one of the primary ways, probably the primary way most of the folks in this room or folks watching at home are exposed to PFAS. In addition to food packaging and the chemicals in food packaging, the PFAS chemicals in food packaging migrating into food, PFAS in irrigation water that's then provided to animals or is used to irrigate crops can also contaminate food. That's especially the case in New Mexico, where Cannon Air Force Base, where Mr. Ferraro served for 4 years, where a dairy farmer was essentially unable to sell his milk. He's now dumping about 15,000 gallons of milk a day. He can't sell his cows because they're so contaminated. Irrigation water is one way that animals become so contaminated that they can no longer be used to provide animal products like milk or meat. The other way that food becomes contaminated is PFAS becomes super concentrated in biosolids that are sold by wastewater treatment plants and then sold to farmers as fertilizer, as was the case in Maine with Fred Stone. And Fred Stone applied PFAS contaminated biosolids or sludge to his fields 15 years ago, which really underscores the forever chemical nature of these substances, and only recently discovered that his cows were so contaminated with PFAS that he was no longer able to sell milk to his co-op or sell his cows for meat. So it's really the tip of the iceberg. We don't really fully understand how many animals are contaminated because of irrigation water, because of contaminated sludge, nor do we know how much of our food supply is contaminated because biosolids were used to fertilize fruit and vegetable crops, or those crops were irrigated with contaminated water. And unfortunately, so far, FDA has been slow to look and understand the scope of PFAS in our food supply, but hopefully that will change.
You're right that biosolids were used by a lot of agriculture, and so we know so little about it, given these are the only examples. I'm about out of time, but it would be somewhat ironic. I understand the DOD is working on settling with that farm in New Mexico, but and as well they should, but it would be somewhat tragic to think that they might settle on that case involving the animals and milk and not being assisting in families who lose a child or go through tragedies like this. The only other thing I would add to my colleagues, if you haven't, there's so much about this that's very interesting, and if you haven't watched the movie called Dark Water, it's about the discovery from a DuPont Teflon making facility, and it's gut-wrenching too. So it's a good way to learn a little bit more about it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. Seeing no other Republican, Judge Carter, I'm going to go to Mr. Cartwright. Okay, Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Judge Carter, for not objecting to that. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Holmes, for being here and sharing this story. It's got to be brutal for you to have to recount that and relive it. But I trust me, I reassure you, we are all listening. You have our strict attention. For Mr. Faber, so we're talking about fire suppressing equipment and chemicals, foam. And the question is, if you have foam that doesn't have PFAS in it, fluorine-free firefighting foam, that's pretty good alliteration. Is that as effective?
Yeah. So one of the tragedies of this story is that when 3M exited the PFOS market in 2000, they created in 2002 and patented a fluorine-free foam. But for reasons we don't have time to cover today, that foam was never commercialized. And there are companies that, there are now 24 companies that are making more than 100 different fluorine-free foams.
Is it more expensive to do it without fluorine?
It is not more expensive. Other countries have adopted the use of fluorine-free foam.
Is
Australia,
it less
Germany.
effective to do it without
It's
fluorine?
as effective as AFFF. Our biggest oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, are using these fluorine-free foams to put out petroleum fires at their facilities.
So, all right,
Their
you
militaries
told us
are
you
using
don't have time to go into the reasons why, but try us. Take 60 seconds.
yeah,
Why
so,
didn't they go to fluorine-free at 3M?
There's a terrific journalist named Sharon Lerner who's really documented it, but the short story is that the lobbyists on behalf of the AFFF industry prevented the deployment of fluorine-free foams.
Okay.
And it's well documented by Sharon in her terrific journalism.
All right, now you tell the story of former Master Sergeant Kevin Ferrara, and you did so again today, who used PFAS-containing firefighting foam for years in training exercise. Do we even know how many military firefighters like Kevin Ferrara might have been exposed to that and have elevated levels of PFAS in their blood serum right now?
You want to guess, Kevin? Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands?
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. And go ahead.
One of the things that really dumbfounded me, sir, I was flying a civilian helicopter by Goodfellow Air Force Base last week. Talked to a military firefighter instructor at Goodfellow. Started talking about PFAS. He did not know that the AFFF was a hazardous chemical. He is currently teaching all the DOD firefighters, and he doesn't know.
All right, so the only way to find out is to test. We're testing people now, but we're not testing retirees, and as you mentioned, Mr. Holmes, we're not testing family members. So first off, rapid fire questions here. How do you test? What do you do to test? Is it a blood test?
A blood test.
Okay. How long does it take?
A few minutes.
How much does it cost?
$500 to $750 is the range that I've heard.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Faber, is there anything else you can think of that we haven't already discussed that we should be doing to accelerate efforts to clean up PFAS-contaminated military installations?
Well, this subcommittee has been was very generous in the FY 2020 bill and providing more funds through BRAC to identify and remediate places like England Air Force Base, where the detection, the highest in the country, is 20 million parts per trillion, 4.3 million parts per trillion. The safe level, according to EPA, 70 million parts per trillion. If we could quickly identify and remediate those BRAC facilities that need to be cleaned up and make the resources available, that would be the first thing on my list.
Well, I thank you for that. Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you also for being here, Mr. Ferrara. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Do any members have additional questions of this panel? Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Faber, the NAS Cecil Field, which was closed through BRAC, is there testing being done out there now that that's private property as well, or do we know?
I don't know. I'm sure Ms. Sullivan would know the answer to that. Well, I'll find out for you, or you can ask Ms. Sullivan. She'll know the
Okay.
latest.
And if you could let me know about Naval Base in Mayport as well.
I will.
Any testing going on there? And I'm trying to remember, Mr. Holmes, you mentioned I forget what you called it, some kind of filter, a point of
There's a
entry
point-
filter that was going to be how much to?
It's approximately $3,500 a household installed. And it's a already EPA-approved granular activated carbon filter that is already EPA-approved to take PFAS out of your water system.
Okay.
And it will take it out of the entire house.
Are you aware of any other types of hazardous materials in Satellite Beach that could be causing these problems as well?
Actually, sir,
Has anybody said, no, that's, you know, the
Actually,
AFFFs
sir, I
aren't the
have the
problem, it's something else?
I have the city manager for Satellite Beach here right now. They did their own testing to see that. The only thing that came up in the water samples was PFAS.
Thank you. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Pingree, and then I'll have one final question, and then we'll switch panels.
Sure, just quickly, I don't think we really asked about what's entailed in a cleanup, like in a BRAC situation. What's the actual methodology, and then how expensive is cleaning it up?
It really varies. So typically it's a pump and treat system where the contaminated water is pumped out of the ground. It's treated through a granular activated carbon filter and returned to the ground. In some cases, there's soil removal. In some cases, there's incineration is involved. It will really, the technology that's deployed and the cost is very site-specific.
But there are sites that have been cleaned up.
Oh, yes, and thanks to the support of this committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, DOD is beginning to spend more resources to clean up legacy PFAS pollution, but it's really the tip of the iceberg.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. Mr. Faber, we have the technology to stop using PFAS-containing products, including fluorinated firefighting foams, correct?
Correct.
So, I mean, it's important to clean up what's already been contaminated. But if we keep using them, then we're contaminating more and more significantly. What steps need to be taken to fully phase out the use of PFAS chemicals and replace them with non-fluorinated formulations?
Well, we need to accelerate efforts to demonstrate that the fluorine-free foams are effective at combating these petroleum-based fires for two reasons. So we can quickly stop using them at military installations, but also because all of our civilian firefighters are following the mil spec, the military spec. So they don't have to. The FAA reauthorization bill changed that. But the practical challenge is that civilian firefighters are now continuing to use fluorinated foams and training as well as in putting out fires. So the sooner we can move away from PFAS foams, the sooner we can move away from AFFF by the DOD, the sooner our civilian firefighters will be able to follow suit. And so that's why it's very important.
Mr. Rutherford, we have a case in Ocala with the firefighting training facility that had astronomically high PFAS contamination and an effort to cover it up as well. So that's on the civilian side. And so this is a problem that goes far beyond just the military.
And Mr. Rutherford, just so you know, the detection at Cecil Field is 980,600 parts per trillion.
Okay. Well, I really look forward to working with members. Obviously, we're somewhat limited because we only have BRAC facilities that we can appropriate these funds for, but we've not reached the submission deadline for any of the 12 appropriations bills, and so I wanted to have this hearing so that we could make sure that, excuse me, so that we could make sure that we could shine a brighter spotlight on this and work together even across other subcommittees to try to see what we can do within our bills to accelerate this process. Yeah, of course, Judge Carter.
Have you got scientific studies that can relate? So, the company saying, no, it doesn't happen. It's eventually going to end up in the courthouse. Is there going to be, well, chances are I used to do that for a living.
Yes, I know you do. That's right. I know, sir.
Have you got the studies to prove it causes cancer?
Yeah, so the Centers for Disease Control, ATSDR, has done an exhaustive toxicological profile of 15 PFAS that relies on animal studies, worker studies, and human studies. But for better or worse, and Mrs. Pingree was referring to this earlier, because of the contamination of drinking water in the Ohio River Valley and the litigation that came as a result of that, we reviewed the blood work and medical records of 70,000 people who were drinking contaminated water for many, many years. And it was that study, it's called the C8 study, that first just found that PFOA, which was used in legacy foam, has been linked to, in particular, testicular cancer and kidney cancer. There's been subsequent studies, primarily animal studies, linking other PFAS to other cancers, especially pancreatic cancer. So there's now a library of evidence, in part because of the medical monitoring case that grew out of Parkersburg, West Virginia, that allows us to say that these chemicals are strongly linked to cancer, but also harm to the reproductive system and harm to the immune system in ways that make vaccines less effective.
Yes, sir.
Sir, one of the things our doctors told us is that when Kayla got cancer, they told us everyone in this room has cancer cells in your body, but you have T cells that fight the tumors. Well, one of the things with PFAS that we found out is it actually suppresses the immune system of adolescents. When you suppress the immune of adolescents, that decreases the T cell production, which allows the cancer cells to grow. And so, common sense says, if their own documentation says that it's immune suppressant is one of the side effects of it. Well, one of the side effects of having a suppressed immune system is cancer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Thank you.
For everybody's benefit, I cough like this all the time.
Yeah.
I do not have this virus,
We'll vouch for him.
but I am the guy they're talking about on TV that's over 70 that has a pulmonary disease.
Well, we appreciate you being here, because I know that that's a difficult decision. So thank you for demonstrating how much you care about the men and women that serve our country and our armed forces. Thank you, Mr. Holmes and Mr. Faber, for joining us, for the work that you're doing to help us shine a spotlight on this very important issue. I'm going to say, from the turnout here that we've had today, as well as the concerns shown on both sides of the aisle, and as Judge Carter said, this is, or Mr. Case said, this is a very bipartisan committee, one in which we work really well together, and we rarely disagree, and usually always find a way to take an approach that focuses on solving a problem. And this is a very serious one, so we will continue to work on this following this hearing. Thank you both. We'll recess briefly so that we can allow for both for the panels to switch out. So the subcommittee will stand in recess for that purpose. Thank you all.
per, and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. We believe DoD is leading the way to address these substances. Over the past 4 years, the department has committed substantial resources and taken actions to respond to concerns with PFAS. In July 2019, as his first act as secretary, Secretary Esper stood up a task force to provide strategic leadership and direction to ensure a coordinated, aggressive, and holistic approach on DoD-wide efforts to proactively address PFAS. The task force has focused on 3 goals: mitigating and eliminating the use of the current aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, understanding the impacts of PFAS on human health, and fulfilling our cleanup responsibilities. CERCLA provides a consistent approach across the nation for cleanup. The Defense Environmental Restoration Program statute provides the authorities to DoD to perform and fund actions and requires they be carried out in accordance with CERCLA. DoD, like other federal agencies, is specifically authorized under CERCLA Section 104 to take action to address pollutants or contaminants like PFAS, regardless of CERCLA hazardous substance designations. DoD's priority is to quickly address PFAS and PFOA in drinking water above EPA's lifetime health advisory, where DoD is the known source. And DoD's actions are consistent with EPA's recommendations. DoD prioritizes sites for action using the longstanding CERCLA risk-based process, worst first. These known and suspected PFAS release areas are in various stages of investigation and cleanup. As the Department of Defense moves through the CERCLA process, we will use the screening levels in EPA's December 19, 2019 memorandum, interim recommendations for addressing groundwater with PFOA and PFAS. Consistent with the CERCLA process, we will work in collaboration with regulatory agencies, communities, and share information in an open, transparent manner. To ensure we are meeting the Secretary's direction to have a coordinated, aggressive, and holistic approach, we are holding the military departments accountable for both progress and investments in fulfilling our CERCLA responsibilities. To prevent further releases into the groundwater, DoD issued a policy in January of 2016 requiring the military departments to stop using AFFF for maintenance, testing, and training. The department treats each release of AFFF as a spill response to limit environmental effects. Currently available AFFF that meets the military specification does not contain detectable amounts of PFAS or PFOA, but may still contain PFAS. None of the commercially available PFAS-free foams meet DoD's strict standards to rapidly extinguish dangerous fuel fires. We are funding extensive research and demonstration projects to identify and test performance of fluorine-free alternatives. In summary, DoD is taking actions to reduce risks from PFAS. Our efforts reinforce DoD's commitment to meeting critical mission requirements while protecting human health. The department recognizes this is a national challenge involving a wide array of industries and commercial applications, as well as many federal and state agencies. Therefore, it needs a nationwide solution. We look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan. We'll proceed with questions, order of arrival by seniority, and please ask your question and make sure the answer is completed within the 5 minutes. I have a lot of questions for you, and we really only have until about 3:45 before they're calling votes again. Many communities around military installations are impacted by PFOS and PFOA contamination from military use. Some of the questions I have is, have you begun the process of evaluating these sites for cleanup? How is the department working with and providing assistance to communities around contaminated installations? Is the department, you heard about the filtration system and their cost, is the department providing any filtration systems or other resources to these communities? Are you providing filtration systems for people on your military sites? We'll just start there.
You've asked a number of questions, ma'am. I'll try and get through all of them.
Okay.
Thank you. First of all, the direction to the military departments was to identify where we have known or suspected releases that have impacted off military installations. And if the drinking water exceeded 70 parts per trillion, EPA's advisory level, to take immediate action. And we are, in fact, funding many communities across the United States to install treatment systems. We've worked with them to develop whatever the solutions are, depending on the local circumstances. In some cases where it's a single well, we may have funded to hook them up to a distribution system. In other communities, we may have funded them to install the granulated active carbon.
Have you done that in the community around Patrick Air Force Base?
I don't know the specifics. I'm not aware of that.
Okay, well, we have the
And that's-
city manager from Satellite Beach, which is the area where Patrick Air Force Base is, behind you, and she's shaking your head that you have not. So, given that that's the most contaminated base in the country, it's hard to know where you're actually, how you're prioritizing these filtration systems and assisting with the evaluation of those sites if you haven't started there.
Well, we're prioritizing where it is tested in drinking water off base, where we are in fact the known source. I do not have the specifics on there. I don't know what's in the drinking water off base, where we are the known source.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure that the Air Force study itself says that you're the known source here. So if you could find out and get back to me, particularly if there's a schedule for when you're going to start looking at the community in and around Patrick Air Force Base, that would be incredibly helpful. I wanted to know a couple of other important questions because there's a long history of this. Some DOD officials have said that DOD is not responsible for legacy PFAS pollution. Is that your view?
No, ma'am, it's not.
Okay. And DOD, my understanding, is going to soon start testing the blood of military firefighters for PFAS. But many retired military firefighters are civilian employees of DOD, and they won't be eligible for VA benefits. Will those civilian employees be eligible for DOD-provided testing?
The testing program will be for all DOD firefighters to include military and civilian.
Okay. When did DOD first understand that PFAS chemicals could be toxic? Did 3M tell DOD prior to 2000 that PFAS was toxic or building up in our blood?
My understanding is we learned when 3M has said this. I have focused on our programs moving forward, not so much what has happened in the past.
Okay, well, if you could look into that, because I'd like to know when DOD learned from 3M that PFAS was toxic and was building up in our blood.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Faber testified that DOD conducted your own studies in the 1970s and 1980s on the toxic effects of PFAS. Who saw those studies, and did the people that were responsible for the use of firefighting foam, were they notified of their risk?
I honestly don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, I would appreciate that if you could do that for the record. Why did DOD wait a decade after learning that 3M was ending the production of PFOS to issue a risk alert?
I'm not involved, so I don't know that. I'll have to get
Isn't that
back
part of your job description? Why don't you know?
I've been looking at our programs going forward and how we're addressing the situation
Okay,
now.
well, when you are trying to make sure that you can protect the public's health, generally you have to know how things occurred
Yes, ma'am.
in order to make sure that you can protect people going forward, and it informs your decisions when you are trying to make sure that you can protect people and prevent them from becoming sick from contamination. So I would think that you would be should be interested in knowing about how we got here so that you could help it inform you on where we need to go.
I've been focusing on the uses around the nation to
Right.
fully understand.
Okay, well, my questions will help you make a determination on what happened before you began focusing on this. And lastly, how is DOD alerting current military service members about the risks posed by PFAS, by PFAS? And how are you from DOD alerting former military service members about the risks that are posed by PFAS? Are you creating a registry to alert former service members and track health effects caused by PFAS?
Ma'am, our Office of Health Affairs has issued information out to the clinicians and provided information for them to provide patients, information to patients that come in. In addition, they are working as required by the National Defense Authorization to explore the feasibility of establishing a registry. In the meantime, we have published additional policies on testing drinking water on our bases that includes the requirements for notifying the population on base and for archiving the information so that it is readily available for any future use.
So at the moment, you're not systematically notifying potentially affected service members, you're only doing it if they come in with a problem?
We have provided information out to all of our installations so that they can provide it consistently to the population on base and to also work with the communities around the base.
And what format are they communicating that information?
We've allowed them to design it based on their particular location and the systems that work very much locally. But they are required to do that. We've provided them information, fact sheets, and we've also required them to begin reporting back to us their progress in terms of this outreach effort.
Okay, my time's expired, but that's the opposite of consistent and uniform. You said you were giving them the information and making sure that it was going to be communicated consistently and uniformly, and now you're saying that you're letting them make those decisions locally.
We're giving them consistent information.
Okay. I'd like more specific information about how this information that you've given them consistently is being communicated to each place where there is potential contamination.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Judge Carter?
Thank you. I stepped out of the room and I'm probably missed a little bit. Back to what you're just describing. So, first off, DOD has an idea where we've got a lot of PFAS contamination. You've done your own studies. You know what
Yes.
posts or bases have problems, right?
Yes, sir, we have.
And your position is you tell and if I'm wrong, tell me. What I understood, you tell the community, you guys need to test your water and find out if you got your PFAS in there. And if you do, we're telling you we may be part of the cause.
Sir, we have gone out to look for all the locations where we have used or stored or released to these AFFF around the country. And where we know we are impacting local drinking water, we have worked with the local community to test that drinking water and provide alternative drinking water if it is above the EPA's advisory level of 70 parts per trillion.
Well, that's good. Fixing the problem is a filter. Is that what you were telling her?
There's various treatment systems, yes.
Yeah. Are you offering them the funds, the local communities?
Yes, we are.
That's good. Because I know one of the things people, at least in Texas, hate is for the government to come in and say, hey, we've created a problem and now clean up our mess. They get real mad about that.
I agree, sir. We're entering cooperative agreements with local communities, and we provide them the funds to take the remedy, or if they want us to do the remedy, it depends on what that community wants in the solution.
So it's the water that has to be cleaned up, not the dirt?
In some cases,
Does dirt have to be cleaned up too?
the dirt will have to be cleaned up depending on the source, yes.
And that can be a pretty expensive process.
Correct,
We pay for that.
correct.
Yeah. Well, at least now the government's on top of it. It's a shame that this man had to lose his daughter for this thing to come forward. We're going to be looking more at this. As you well know, we're not the big budget. I have to serve on the committee that is the big budget, And I'm looking forward to see if we can't do something on our defense appropriations bill too.
And we thank
Money
you.
into this. We may already be doing it and I don't know it, but we need to do more. You can't ask a guy or gal to go to war and then come back and find out their family's been poisoned. It just doesn't play well.
Sir,
It's not good recruiting material.
I agree. And Congress has been very generous in this area, and we appreciate the additional funds that they have directed at this program.
Well, we'll do what little we can with what we've got, but I will be supportive of doing more under the big bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Ms. Pingree?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here with us today and helping us to understand a little better about what's going on through this process. I have a couple of questions here, and I'm going to read them because they're so full of acronyms. I don't want to get any of them wrong. It's about the National Guard and some of the issues on lack of parity. So Section 316 of the NDA prohibits the use of PFAS for land-based applications of firefighting foam. It was Congress's intent to provide the National Guard full access to DERP funds, but we have heard that the Office of the Secretary of Defense may be considering an interpretation that it provides only limited access to only federal sites or to only PFAS and PFOA contamination and/or request approval through the Office of the OSD for each contaminated site. The number of these sites runs into the hundreds, and preventing the Guard from being able to quickly respond to contamination and leaving their families at risk in the meantime. So when can DOD commit to implementing the guidance to address this issue?
So several issues there, ma'am, I understand.
A lot of acronyms.
A lot of acronyms, yes. So first of all, let me assure you that the department is committed to ensuring that the National Guard has the funds needed to address PFAS and PFOA associated with their activities. The issue that has happened is that the language in the National Defense Authorization Act of FY20 attempted to allow them access to the Defense Environmental Restoration Account funds versus the Guard O&M accounts where we had put the money. There was a slight drafting problem, which I have already discussed with the Armed Services Committee, that segregated the language in terms of the contractual relationship between the Department of Defense and the National Guards. And we're working with them to address that as rapidly as possible.
Great, and so we'll follow that and
Yes.
look forward to being resolved. So just one more question on the scope of PFAS in the Air National Guard. The full extent of PFAS contamination has only come to light in the last few years, as we all know. In my home state of Maine, PFAS was first discovered in the groundwater at former military installations from firefighting foam, and has since, as many of these discussions have been found in our public water supply, soil, and animal products. What's the scope of PFAS contamination in the Guard? Do you have an idea, and do you know which states are most impacted?
The scope is pretty extensive.
Mm-hmm.
There's hundreds of installations, including Guard installations all over the country, and I think it is, I haven't looked at the map lately, honestly, but I think it's every state.
Got it.
So-
Let's see if I have something else. Do you have any idea what the estimated PFAS, PFOA cleanup will cost?
I've
For the- for the-
I've gotten in trouble for answering that question before, ma'am. Right now, the estimate based on what we know now on where we are in the process is somewhere around $3 billion, but I expect that cost will grow as we further in the investigations and design the remedies to address the groundwater that was discussed earlier.
So you'll be addressing those estimates so that Congress has the opportunity to fully
Correct.
fund these cleanup costs? What, if any, issues have you had with the Air Force regarding FY20 PFAS funds?
Congress has been very generous with the Air Force. They added $100 million to their request in the Defense Environmental Restoration Account. And then there was additional money in the base realignment and closure account to address PFAS. So they have a lot of money in FY20 to conduct a lot of work.
Great. Well, I hope we'll see a lot of cleanup proceeding quickly. Again, thank you for your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Sullivan, for being here. I want to go back to 2009 when the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, the department started two programs. The Strategic Environmental Research Development Program and the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, and both of these were in response to the EPA having come out with those guidelines on long-term health advisories for these compounds. And it says in 2014, you began looking at remediation possibilities at that time. Has anything not advanced in the last 6 years? I mean, the only thing I'm hearing is a point of entry filter. What other, are there ideas that have come out of these two studies?
Well, there's been a lot of research on to understand how it moves in the soil, how it moves in water, to improve those treatment processes as well. There's been a lot of efforts in terms of sampling methodologies. Right now, the final methodologies for testing are only for EPA final methods are only for drinking water, and we need methodologies to test soil, to test groundwater, to test other media. Okay. So there's been a lot of investment in those areas as well.
And you mentioned the other media, and I wanted to follow up on that. I'm curious because we're talking a lot about groundwater, but I heard earlier food packaging, a lot of other ways that our men and women that are serving could be harmed by this chemical, and I'm sure not just them, but the public at large, and so are you looking at those different media as well, and what have we discovered there?
I defer to the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Agriculture when it comes to food and food packaging. That's what their responsibility are. So we look to them to address those issues. Okay,
well, let me get right back to the real source for us today then, and that is the PFAS. The NDAA passed by Congress last year included that they stop using PFAS in firefighting foam and other applications, and to cooperate with affected communities and begin cleanup and all of that. And that was supposed to end by 2024. Do you support that language that was in NDAA last year?
We will do everything that is required by the statute. We are investing heavily in finding an alternative foam that will meet the requirement. We are evaluating the military specification to determine how we can address. So, for example, the military specification is written for at-sea use. So it must be compatible with salt water. Is that necessary for a land-based fire? We're exploring all of the opportunities here and working extensively with academia, with industry, with other federal agencies, with other countries to find a solution that still protects our service members.
So the NDAA left out the designation of PFAS as a comprehensive environmental response compensation. It left it out of CERCLA last year, or the Superfund hazardous substance, and requires them to promulgate PFAS drinking water standards. And are you supportive of that being now included in NDAA?
I've always said that I support EPA going through the process established under the Safe Drinking Water to establish an MCL. As I've said, under CERCLA, there is actually a separate section for federal agencies. So regardless of the hazardous substance designation, we are already required to follow the Superfund law and address our cleanup responsibilities.
Okay. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Can you elaborate on what you just said about establishing a Superfund?
No, under CERCLA, the Superfund law,
Right.
the Section 104 applies to federal agencies only. And it says when EPA declares a pollutant or contaminant, and once they issued a lifetime health advisory, it was a pollutant, we are required to follow CERCLA. So we have to proceed under the Superfund law, CERCLA, to identify and address, which we are doing.
Okay. When I had an opportunity to question the representatives of the companies that manufacture these chemicals, none of them would say that, one of them would say that they felt that there needed to be Superfund declarations. And of course, one of those that refused to make that declaration was 3M. So this continues to be a problem that they are irresponsibly denying. I've heard some NATO allies in civilian European airports are in both military and civilian European airports are already phasing out fluorinated firefighting foam. Why hasn't DoD taken steps to replace AFFF with non-fluorinated formulations, and what steps are you taking to make sure that you meet the 2024 deadline for complete phase-out?
So,
and why is it taking so long?
it is a complex scientific question, ma'am. We are investing heavily in the research and development and demonstration. If anyone has a product, we are open to testing it and demonstrating it to see if it can meet our standard required in terms of the amount of time, the basic safety standards, the amount of time it takes to knock down the fire and put out the fire so it doesn't reignite. And that's the challenge we have.
But just to interrupt you for a moment, but the Europeans appear to be able to have begun phasing out that firefighting foam. So why aren't we? I mean, why? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, I assume they want to put out fires as quickly as we do. So why aren't you able to keep up with them in terms of using the alternatives that they are pursuing?
We are watching them very carefully, ma'am. They are, in fact, taking a different standard than we are in terms of protecting our service members. So they accept a longer time frame to knock down the fire and put it up than we are willing to accept from a safety perspective.
How much longer does their foam that they're using take compared to our standard?
My understanding is at least 3 times as long.
Is that seconds, minutes?
Seconds.
Seconds, okay. I mean, at a certain point, there's a tipping point between making sure that we can put fires out quickly and save lives and making sure that we're not using contaminated foam that's contaminating people and killing them.
And I want to reiterate my statement that we are only using it for actual emergencies now, and when it is used, we are actually capturing it so it doesn't go further into the soil or the groundwater. So we're not adding to the presence in the environment with the ways we use it now.
It seems unlikely that you're going to develop a drop-in solution that is interchangeable with the current AFFF formulation by 2024. You nearly said as much in your response to Mr. Rutherford. We're not expecting do the best you can. We're expecting it to happen. We're not kidding when we put language into the appropriations bills. So what technological equipment solutions are you examining so you can achieve the phase-out on time?
The range of solutions is wide depending on the circumstances. We're currently evaluating how to address it in hangars, in hazardous storage facilities, in fuel storage facilities, and looking at the range of options, technical solutions that may be alternatives that can address this. We will stop using the foam as required by the deadline, and find and choose to accept risk if there is not, something hasn't been developed in that amount of time.
Okay. And when will you have a firm grasp on the cost of replacement? And are you adequately funded to meet the new requirements to replace the foam by 2024?
To replace the foam by 2024 it is a complicated question, ma'am, and we have to address that. We have identified that we may not be able to clean the trucks. So we are investing in research and development to see if there's a way to clean the insides of the trucks rather than to replace them. We are doing the inventory of hangars and storage facilities and fuel infrastructure to determine the scope of what we have to begin to do the estimate.
Okay, my time has expired, and I don't have any additional questions. Do either of you gentlemen? Sure, Mr. Judge Carter.
Do you or do you not know about the Forest Hall fire?
I do, sir.
Was that this foam that they were fighting that fire with?
No, sir, it was one of the reasons this foam was developed.
Okay. So if I got the story correct, and I read this very fascinating last night, they were spraying water from one side of the aircraft carrier and foam from the other, and the water washed the foam away, and the foam would have solved the problem, but the water washed it away. Is that the reason you have to have special water issues with this foam? Because that's what we were told. It's only for land, because the Navy uses water with foam.
It has to do with I'm not sure of those circumstances, sir. I know that it the criteria, whatever the concentrate is for shipboard, has to be compatible with salt water, because that is the largest. That's the source of water. That may not be, having salt water may impact the chemistry, so we want to make sure that we understand if we use water on land, and we not have the same compatibility problem.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions, as we conclude this afternoon's hearing, Ms. Sullivan, this is going to be the beginning of our oversight on your progress. This is, a responsibility of our subcommittee as it relates to, BRAC facilities, and so following the cleanup and, appropriating tens of millions of dollars each fiscal year to make sure that cleanup can continue is critical, and we'll be working across the appropriations bills, the relevant appropriations bills, to make sure that we can help you accelerate the process. So we appreciate you joining us today. I want to thank all of the panels who were with us this afternoon. We look forward to working with all of you as we craft our FY21 appropriations bill. I want to remind members that our next hearing is tomorrow, Thursday, March 12th at 9 a.m. in 2362A Rayburn, which is the Ag hearing room, and that will be with the Navy. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.